So, how long is this going to take?
You can't rush art.
Hi guys, so welcome back to my channel. This is a video that I wasn't planning on doing, but a booktuber that I watch a lot. I watch his stuff as soon as it comes up. I watch every one of his videos, and I'm hoping to meet him soon. We're going to go book hunting, I think, soon. Criminolly, so a very popular, quite rightly, booktuber. So you guys probably know him if you're looking at my channel. Criminolly, Ollie, he does these Sunday discussion videos. And today's one was about his dilemma about starting a series of books and the big, the series that go beyond trilogies usually, because he was saying that he thinks a trilogy is quite manageable, but when it's like insanely long, especially when each book's really long, he starts thinking, well, do I want to invest all this time in this story, you know, that goes across this whole thing? And I think that's a really good point. And I wanted to do a video rather than just one comment, because I think the comment would have been, it wouldn't have said enough. So I thought I'd do a video. So this is like a response video. So hi Ollie, this is a video talking about the idea of how these series get developed, and this idea of comparing a standalone to a duology to a trilogy to a whole series of books, and the way that a reader can get sucked into it. Some readers relish it and think, oh, I love the world building stuff. But I don't know. I mean, I sometimes think it could be lazy writing, that they'd have to keep creating a world because it's already been done in the previous book, and they just sort of add little aspects to it. But it's like bouncing off the previous book all the time. I don't know. Some people would say it's more ambitious because the world building is more complex. That's true as well. So I think possibly the truth is somewhere between those two things. But as a reader, I've had quite a varying set of experiences with trilogies, series of books, you know, books set in the same world. So I thought I'd just talk about that kind of thing, I guess, and just talk about the fact that I much prefer, I get more excited when it's a standalone book, because I feel like I'm going to read a really good story, and that story is going to be really satisfying at the end, and I'm going to think, great book, if it's a great book. When it's the start of a series, if it's been raved about, I'm usually quite enthusiastic about it, but I do think I'm not quite as excited as I am with a standalone book, I think, because I also feel like I'm going to have this sort of commitment that is connected to me enjoying the first book. So some people would get excited about that, but you know, we've only got so many years in our life, so many months, so many weeks, so many books we can read, and if you spend, you know, a whole bunch of time reading 15 books in one world, that means that's 14 books you could have been delving into other worlds. So, you know, I mean, that's kind of a bit of a debate. But I have had positive and negative experiences with this kind of stuff, so I thought I'd just discuss it, and you guys could say, if you like, whether you think you agree or can relate to some of the things I've said about some of the specific book series I'm going to talk about. And if Ollie's watching, then you might be able to say if there was specific examples that I've said that you didn't mention in your video that you think, yeah, that's what I felt about the series. Or you might go, you know, oh, well, actually, I didn't even bother reading that one, or I had a different experience with that series. Some of the things you've mentioned in your video, I'm going to mention. I've got no interest in reading the Malazan at the minute, because it just seems to be one of those examples of being impressive rather than exciting from what I can see. But I don't know, it could be just vibes I'm getting that aren't really true, but it just seems to be clever rather than really good. I don't know, but what I've heard hasn't really excited me. But I would before I talk about books, stories, novels, a series of novels, I want to just mention the fact that this clearly has some parallels with other art forms. So films, clearly it's really obvious when you get loads of sequels and you get trilogies made for films that are really successful. You get lots of people complaining and saying, oh, why do they keep making trilogies? Why do they keep making prequels and sequels and that kind of stuff? And that can, again, have varying degrees of success. And you could have, you know, obviously the Star Wars franchise have got tons of stuff going on. I quite liked, well, I like quite a lot of the Star Wars films, but again, you can definitely argue that it's lazy writing sometimes. Same as, well, anything really. I mean, any of the film franchises quite often contain some element of lazy writing, but when they don't try and rely on previous work and they kind of try and go outside the box a little bit, sometimes it can be a little bit too, what are you doing, with some film franchises. So I think sometimes the Alien franchise, they've tried too hard sometimes, and this has been a little bit badly received. And so sometimes film franchises get into that sort of trouble, and ultimately it's kind of similar, isn't it? But it's a different experience because you invest so much time into a book, whereas with a film, if you did feel like you wasted time or they went off in a stupid direction or it wasn't as good as the original, you've only wasted 2 or 3 hours. So I think that's one of the issues with how much time and commitment you put into a book series. But also, you can also say that there's some parallels with music. So good examples here. I mean, if you guys know Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, hugely successful album. It was #1 for a year in the album charts, and it basically created his career, but also created Virgin Records. So you can blame Tubular Bells for creating the monster that is Richard Branson. And really successful album. He had some success after that, but nowhere near parallels to Tubular Bells. And then fast forward to sometime later, he releases Tubular Bells 2, which is basically him reworking the melodies and chord progressions that were in the original album. And that was really successful, more successful than his previous albums in the gap. And then fast forward a few years later, he does Tubular Bells 3, which actually was probably better than Tubular Bells 2, but that's not the point. This is it's like, Mike, write some new music. What's the matter with you? So I do think that's a little bit odd. And then equally, in a similar way, famously, Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell was hugely successful, quite rightly. I think it's a great album. And he had sort of varying degrees of success after that. And then, because he fell out with Jim Steinman, there's all stuff like that about their relationship that kind of complicated all that. And he worked with other songwriters, didn't get the kind of success he got from his first album. Eventually, they made up and they said, let's do another Bat Out of Hell. Bat Out of Hell 2 came out. And the fact that it had Bat Out of Hell in the title, they thought it was kind of like a sequel. So they're creating a sequel in the music industry. And do they need to do that? I don't know. Again, it's kind of lazy promotion. In a sense, you could call it lazy songwriting because they're relying on the past to create this buzz about their writing. So there are parallels with music as well as with film. But with the books, I think it's quite an interesting complication because you've got various versions of continuing stories, like duologies, trilogies. There's also the question of continuing series that's set in a particular world, but they're not actually connected. And similarly, when a book series is just hanging on to a character rather than the world, and then it's just the character has different adventures, that's obviously really common. And I don't really think that's an issue because that can be, you can just pick up a book and read it and leave it. And there could be a series of 9 books and you've read 1, 4 and 7. And if you enjoyed those books, it doesn't really matter. So I think the issue becomes this commitment thing and this idea that you've got some sort of pressure to finish it, or it gets confusing with all the world building stuff. And if you're reading 2 series that are similar, which I'll get onto in a minute, it can be like, I have to leave this other series so I can finish this series. Otherwise, I'm going to be, which series am I in with this because it's too similar. So I think that's one of the issues. So let's talk specifics. So go right back to the first things I read. I'll try and get through those first. So Lord of the Rings, clearly a great example of a trilogy that most people love who've read it. Some people have said, I've seen people recently say that they're not particularly gripping and there are lots of extra stuff in there you don't need. That is true. They're not absolutely faultless, but I think most people that read it love it. And it was a very important part of my childhood reading Lord of the Rings. But obviously that is one huge story. I mean, it was supposed to be one huge story. The reason why it's in 3 books is because of the way it was published. And there was a shortage of paper and stuff like that. So there are economic reasons why it came in 3 books. But that is an example of how you can't really separate that idea that it's one big story and it's in 3 chunks, and it has to be. You couldn't just stop it at the end of two Towers. So that's absolutely true. That is very similar to another thing I read when I was younger. If you like, I was going to do a video about this series, or I need to reread it first, but it's kind of like my Harry Potter, if you like, which is the Belgariad series by David Eddings. That series, again, you can't stop the story in the middle of it, and it is one big story. So, it's 5 books. It's not like 9 books or 11 books, 13 books, I haven't read Game of Thrones books, but obviously there's quite a lot of those. I think, is there 8 books, something like that? And they're very big. I think 5 books, you should be able to tell a big, expansive, epic story in 5 books. You should, you should be able to do it in 3, but I don't know. Should I be saying the word should in this? I don't know. But certainly the Belgariad was a big deal for me when I was younger, and I did love the fact that he had this long quest, epic fantasy story that was unfolding in these 5 books. So that's clearly a successful example for me. But you get the... so also I read the Shannara books. So I read the first 3, and again, they were linked, but they kind of felt a bit separate as well. And I've bought a bunch of Shannara books secondhand recently, because I was thinking I might read some of the others, but I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of torn. I don't know if you guys want to recommend them, or if you think, nah, stay clear. But the Terry Brooks Shannara series, definitely enjoyed the first 3 when I was younger, literally when I was about 15, 16, and they were separate, or from what I remember, they were quite separate. But it was like different members of the family, I think, so different descendants or relatives of the initial main character, Joel Shannara. I think if the key here, I think, is that if it's one massive long story, then I'd say it was quite nice if you can keep it in a relatively small amount of books. And if it's not, and they're just tied together by characters, then I think you can do what you want in some ways, because they're standalone books, really. They're just in a series, a world-building series, but they're still standalone. So there are some examples, like I'll just talk about Ursula K. Le Guin's Hainish Cycle, where she's set this series of books in this huge, expansive world of different planets and different species. But again, they're standalone books, so you can see recurring species and characters sometimes. Do you see many? I don't know if you see recurring characters, but you certainly see recurring species and planets. But they don't feel like they're ultimately hugely connected. So I think it's more of a concept than the reality of the reading experience with Ursula K. Le Guin's books. So I think that's quite a positive thing, because it's quite cool that she's built this huge, expansive universe, but it doesn't drag the reader down and doesn't make them think, oh, which one's the next one I've got to read, and is this a reference to this? Do I need to concentrate on this aspect of it, or is it just a story? So I do think that that's quite a positive thing. And that could be true about the Dresden Files. I don't know. I've only read the first 2 books, and apparently it keeps building on the lore of the universe of the Dresden Files. So clearly that's going to build up. But it'd be nice, don't know yet, but it'd be nice if each book is a standalone book within that expanding universe. That is true for the Rivers of London series, which I think is quite comparable. But again, because they have quite similar concepts, I'm kind of always debating, do I read a Rivers of London books, or should I read more of the Dresden Files, and should I finish the Rivers of London books because there's fewer of them, and then crack on with the Dresden Files books? If they're similar, I don't want to be, thinking, is this something I read in this series, or is this something I read 3 books ago in this other series? Is this relevant to this? So I think that's a bit of an issue as well. It's only a small issue, because ultimately, if the book stands on its own, I do think it should stand on its own, then it's not really a problem. So similarly, the Mistborn experience is something I've just had. So I've just read the first Mistborn book. I've got a second one to read once I've read through some stuff I'm trying to get through for some challenges and that. And I'm looking forward to reading it. I think it's The Well of Ascension is the second book. I'm looking forward to reading it. I did really like the first book, but it also felt quite complete as well. So I love the way he wrote. So I'm sure Brandon Sanderson is just a great writer. I mean, everyone keeps saying it, and definitely that's what I felt like reading the first book. So I'm sure it's fine, but it would be just really nice if there's that kind of standalone, kind of beginning, middle, and end feeling to each book anyway, even if it's in the same universe. But we'll see. Similarly, I've read the first book of The Expanse, and I've now got the first 4 books, and I want to carry on reading that. But it did feel like the first one ended in a really finite way, so I'm not sure how it develops, whether or not they decided to start writing it as a series, and then it becomes more bogged down in world building, or not necessarily bogged down in world building, but just has that aspect to it in a deeper level, maybe. Or it could be that it keeps that standalone aspect and it's just an extra quality to it that's got that world building aspect. That could be the case, so we'll see as we read it. But I just hope they work as standalone books. I just think it's nice if you've got the start of a story, you get settled in, it's got a nice fun ending, and it's not like, okay, I've got to read the next one to get an ending. Similarly with the duologies that I've read, so the Semiosis book by Sue Burke, I've got the second one, and I haven't read that yet, but again, the first one ended in a quite a finite way. Doesn't have to have a follow-up, but a follow-up is probably going to sort of develop things they started, but I'm hoping it's only going to be 2 books, but who knows. I might finish the second one and still think, oh yeah, I can have more of that. Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I absolutely love the first book, absolutely love Children of Time, but I did find the second one a lot harder work. I don't think it had the same spirit to it, and I don't know if, I'd love to know what Adrian Tchaikovsky says about the writing experience of writing that second book, but it does feel like the intent behind it, or the tone of his writing and how it feels like he was feeling when he was writing it, was totally different. It's like The Hitchhiker's the fifth book. The 5th book in the Hitchhiker series is really downbeat, and apparently when he wrote that, he was going through quite a lot with an illness, and he was very unhappy as a person, and you can see that, or at least it makes much more sense when you know that when you're reading Mostly Harmless, the 5th book. So it's nowhere near as funny, and it could be because he's just, he's not in the right frame of mind to write that kind of Hitchhiker's tone that was in the previous books. And I think that is definitely, I felt that in the second Children of Time book. I felt like the first book had an incredible pace to it, it had a real charisma to it, and I think it was lacking a bit in the second book. So sometimes that can happen, and you've got all these expectations because of the first book, and then the second book doesn't really have that kind of thing going on. I absolutely loved Nicholas Eames' Kings of the Wild, a fantasy story about these kind of mercenaries that get back together again to save one of the mercenaries' daughter. Absolutely love that book. I've done a separate video on it. I've got the second book, and from what I gather, it's a completely different story with like the next generation of mercenaries, and it just looks like it's just going to be a kind of a coincidence that it's in the same world. And if it's same tone, same kind of writing ability, same kind of pace, but it just happens to be in the same world, that'd be awesome. So I do think, it's just getting that idea that what's good about the first book remains, and it's not like, doesn't feel like it's been forced to carry on building that world. I mean, if you could think about fantasy, and obviously the most obvious example of an expanding world in the fantasy world is the Discworld books. And the Discworld books are really good examples of books where you can pick different books and they work on their own. You do get recurring characters, but they're not the kind of recurrence of characters that force you to read them in a particular order. You can do, but if you don't, the storytelling doesn't suffer, and you've got different aspects of the Discworld being explored in different series that are within the big series of Discworld. So the Discworld books, they just work really well because each of them stand alone. as one story within itself, and I think that's so important. And he builds on the characters, he builds on the city of Ankh-Morpork, he builds on all sorts of different ways. He builds on the Discworld universe through the books at different points according to what fits the story. And I think that works really well. And I think it's quite unique in the sense of having such a huge, expansive world built quite slowly over very specific stories that have been told in different parts of that world. And then that kind of goes back to different parts according to which part of the series it was. So I think that's really impressive the way he did that. And again, crucially, they work as standalone stories. The Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers is another example like that. I haven't read the fourth one yet. I can't wait to read the fourth one. It's now on paperback, so I'm going to be reading that soon. The first three books I've read, and I really, really like them. Second book I've mentioned before because I chose that for something about AI I did on the Aspects of Science Fiction video, I think it was. And the Wayfarer series is really interesting. Again, kind of refers back to previous books, but not in a way that affects the story. Very separate stories, separate characters, but again, within a universe that she's created. So I think, kind of similar to Ursula K. Le Guin, doesn't have to be linked, but it's linked thematically, geographically, I guess, but not in a way that affects the story. So I think that's really cool. So just one last thing I wanted to say about this, and that's the idea of the character-based consistency in the series. So series of books that are linked by the character. So obviously you've got James Bond, you've got Sherlock Holmes, you've got big characters where the stories are separate and what is consistent is the character. Loads of examples of that. And I can't really blame authors for going back to the same characters because you end up loving the character, you want to write more about them. And it's not really easier to do that. So it's not lazy writing because you still got to come up with a whole new plot and new characters they're interacting with and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think you can accuse authors of being lazy by doing that. And quite often readers love that. So it's not, it's quite common for an author to go back to the same character. So that's not an issue at all, I don't think. But just to mention three examples of that kind of thing that I think worked really well for me. When I was a kid, really loved the Stainless Steel Rat books by Harry Harrison. And those books did develop in the sense that the second one, he met Angelina, who he ended up getting married to, and then they had kids. In the fourth book, and then in the fifth book, his kids are quite old and they get involved in the plot in a big way. And the development of the family is a part of the Stainless Steel Rat story and the Stainless Steel Rat books, which is very different from the first book, which you wouldn't necessarily imagine that they're going to develop into a family from the first book. So Harry Harrison could have made that decision later, and he might have thought it was quite a cool thing to do to this sort of slippery Jim DeGriz with this character that is a bit of a rogue. So that may have become later, but it definitely is the case that you've got to read them in order, but they're very separate stories. So if you didn't read them in order, it wouldn't really matter, but you might wonder, oh, okay, this guy's got kids now. So that is true. But if you look at Jodie Taylor's Chronicles of St. Mary series, which I really like this series. I can't decide if they're YA or not. And after like the third book, I thought, oh, sorry, I don't care if it's YA or not. I'm enjoying it. It's funny, and I like the way she writes. I'm on the 8th book, so I've read quite a lot of the books now, and there is an order, and it kind of makes sense because there are elements of the plot that are developing from the previous one, but actually, in a lot of ways, the link is quite loose. So there is clearly a very important link, and that's the setting of this university where they send historians back in time to see what actually happened in these moments in history. And Max, the main character, she sort of bumbles through it and things happen to her, and the plot develops in a big way through the series of books. That concept clearly remains consistent, but it doesn't really matter if you did read them out of order, I think. I mean, I have read them in order, but if I didn't, I don't know if it would have really affected how much I enjoyed it. So I think that's quite good, and I do think they're really good books. I think they're a lot of fun. So those Chronicles of St Mary's books, I think, are good examples of a book series that's in order. But if you did accidentally pick the wrong one, I think you'd still enjoy it. I don't think you'd be like, well, what's going on here? So you could argue that's because not enough happens in the actual narrative development, but I'm not sure about that. And again, going back to the trilogy idea, Alistair Reynolds' Revenger series, I really enjoyed that. That was another situation where I wasn't sure if I was reading YA or not, and I ended up just not caring. And it's definitely, I like those books more than the other Alistair Reynolds books I've read so far. But the Revenger series, about the two girls that end up kind of being space pirates, really a lot of fun, and the plot, very importantly, very significantly, is a beginning, middle, and end. Those 3 books are a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think that works really well. Trilogies are very popular for a reason, I think. I think the idea of a beginning, a middle, and an end just works. So I do think that when we see that, there's a reason why it's a very nice, digestible, consistent, sensible way of reading a story. You get that within one novel, you get a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you get that in a series as well. And there's another example of that I thought was really good, which is the Drew Williams series that starts with the book Stars Now Unclaimed. Really like that series. And that's 3 books. And each time it kind of builds on what happened before. Again, if you'd finished at the first book or you finished at the second book, you'd still feel satisfied with what you'd read. But it does build on it. And The Firmament of Flames, I think, is the 3rd book. That ends really well with this sort of big question that's been haunting all 3 books being answered, and it's got a really nice finale. And I think that's probably what's good about the trilogy idea, that you can make this big epic ending that kind of sums up what you've been reading and kind of gives you a nice conclusion to some of the questions that are in the other books. So that can work really well. But I don't know if you need to write 16 books in a series. I mean, a lot of people rave about the Wheel of Time books. I can't imagine starting a 16-book series. Again, the Malazan books, I mentioned that earlier, that Ollie mentioned them. And, people seem to celebrate how complex it is, and it just feels like just sounds like hard work. I don't know. Maybe I'm being a lazy reader, or maybe, storytelling doesn't have to be incredibly academic. I don't know. But yeah, I think my conclusions in this, again, to quote Ollie, a rambling video, is I do think books need to work as standalone books anyway, in case you don't keep reading it. And on that note, I haven't read the Game of Thrones series, but I don't think I would be that upset if I didn't finish it, if the books were really good up to that point, personally. But I haven't read them, so I don't know. So I think it's really good if they work as standalone stories. Duologies can be quite cool, and trilogies, again, can have that beginning, middle, and end. And when it comes to series of books that are all based around a character, that's the consistent thing, the character, then I don't even think it's a series of books in the same sort of way as the narrative series anyway, because you're just using the same character. So, but then you get examples like Discworld, where he's built the series up, the universe up for Discworld really well, without being bogged down by developing every aspect of it in every book. So I do think you can do it really cleverly, like Terry Pratchett did. But then again, you got, like I mentioned, the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker series, and we were expecting a particular kind of tone with the 5th book, Mostly Harmless, and it's not very funny. And Douglas Adams was just not feeling it when he wrote it, apparently. That's been some of the justification for it. So, I think that's the thing as well. You have these expectations if they're in a particular series. Maybe if you wrote a different book, we wouldn't even be judging it by the standards of the comedy or whatever, the tone of it in the other books. So, authors have a consistent voice, a narrative voice, in the way they write. And that is a given. That's a good thing. But I don't know that you have to read 9, 11, 16 books in a series to get a story. So anyway, yeah, that's my sort of feelings about that. I don't know if anyone can relate to anything I've said, and I'm not going to make a habit of making rambling videos, but I thought this was a better response, possibly incorrectly, to just writing a few sentences on Ollie's video. So this is a video response to Ollie's video about book series, and I just think make them stand alone within a series. I think that's my conclusion. So, thanks a lot for watching. See you later. Bye.
Paint me a picture of what it's like to be you. Sit up on your high chair